You're now listening to Mixed Mental Arts with Brian Callen and Hunter Motz.
But it is this ability to sit between worlds, to be able to come from an outside cultural perspective, like you're talking about with math and physics, and to be able to see things that other people couldn't see. And even Newton, I've referenced before, I actually misreferenced. I referenced the wrong biography, but James Gleick's biography of Newton talks about how, Newton's alchemy was important to him making the conceptual leap to think that gravity could act at a distance without objects having to physically touch or interact in some way.
Yeah, because that's kind of insane if you think
it
about
is.
it. At the time, you're like, what are you smoking? And I don't know what he was smoking, but, it
mercury.
was good stuff. Mercury. Okay, that makes sense.
Yeah, a lot of mercury vapor involved in alchemy, so that was probably what it was. But so the point is that it is these people who have these many competing perspectives that are able to, Newton has that great line, if I've seen a little further, it is because I've stood on the shoulders of giants. And so that is part of the reason why he is able to see a little bit further. So in terms of, Maxwell combines, electricity and magnetism, and then there is this weak and strong nuclear force that exists within the nucleus.
Yeah.
And then...
And unifying those, right? That was huge. I mean, Feynman had something to do with it, along with many other incredible physicists that they all got Nobel Prizes exactly because of that. Because they're like, okay, what if they all come from the same place?
Mm-hmm.
And it turned out the main concept was what is called symmetry breaking, spontaneous symmetry breaking, where you have symmetry in the universe and every time it breaks, you get order. Right? The same way that the symmetry of a liquid, of water, right? It looks the same everywhere. Once it breaks, you get ice, you get crystallization, right? And that's actually exactly how I see the laws of physics. I see reality at a more fundamental, deeper level as being more like this liquid where everything is like uniform. Everything is equally likely, right? And because of that, you don't have to explain any of it. There is none of these configurations of atoms or like much further than that where there are no atoms or even fields, right? No specific fundamental configurations are more likely than any other ones, really, right? It's very, really random at that place. It's kind of like water, right? And it's only when you zoom out, only when we ask questions that are not at that level of resolution, right? When you really zoom out, when you take your face off of the screen where you're watching a movie and you really walk backwards, you can no longer see the individual colors like in hues and saturation of each pixel, but you get to see the face. Only at that point, you lose your resolution, but you gain meaning, you gain perspective, right? And then you create laws. You cannot predict each individual pixel when your face is right next to it, right? What is going to be maybe 30 seconds from now. But once you zoom out and you see it's part of a face, and that face is talking, and you can predict that within 5 seconds from now, it will still be talking, so the pixel is most likely going to be the same. We gain predictive power. We create theories once we get that to the level of emergence where it's no longer random, where you get order to emerge from chaos. Literally, like chaos, you can think of it as just everything being uniform, right? You crystallize the laws of physics by zooming out from something where these laws do not exist.
And so this is also crucially why, this sort of the theory of everything is kind of misleading, right? Because the theory of everything would make sense of that water, that underlying sort of uniformity, but it wouldn't be very useful necessarily in making sense of sort of...
It wouldn't be useful at all because there would be no law. It would say that's likely, that's likely, that's likely. It would be the same thing as you trying to make a rule out of like flipping a coin, again, however many times you want, it's a fair coin, right? And then trying to predict what you're going to see.
Right.
It just wouldn't work, right? Because every time you would get pretty much like a new thing, you would have to keep track of every one of them. They're all equally likely. If you flip a coin 100 times, there's 2 to the 100, almost like 10 billion thousand combinations, right? Of what you will get.
Right.
Head, tails, like, and so on and so forth. There is no theory that will tell you, right, that like, no, that's the one. It's only when we humans, and it's not just humans, but like other larger objects or larger entities in the universe at the zoomed out level, right, from the more fundamental place, only when we ask questions at that other level, right, that we get order to emerge. And let me make it explicit also for the audience, right? Again, the coin flip. Right? What if you don't ask, right, that you get 100 heads in a row or then 50 heads and then 50 tails when you try it, right? They're both equally unlikely. It's just like almost impossible to get that. What if you ask a different question? You remove the resolution of the question and you say, how many heads did I get? I don't care where they were when I flipped the coin. All I can keep track of is how many. You just count. All of a sudden, getting 50 heads, and then the rest 50 tails, obviously, is like 30 orders of magnitude more likely than saying the answer to the question is 100 heads.
Mm-hmm.
Because of the number of combinations that you can get 50 heads anywhere among the 100. There's a sharp increase, what is called a concentration of measure. Like the probability, instead of being flat, where everything is equally likely, it bunches up really quickly into what we call the bell curve. Right? And becomes very, very sharp. And the sharper it is, you imagine as that being truth. Everything else lost, right? It used to be equally likely, equally possible. But everything else from that point of emergence, right, loses out because 100 heads is now much more unlikely than 50 heads.
So you've defined what you're searching for. You've defined what your standard is.
You're having a macro, like a coarse graining, right, of reality at a deeper level. The same way that biology coarse grains chemistry, and chemistry coarse grains quantum chemistry, and quantum chemistry coarse grains quantum physics and quantum field theory, right? At every level of emergence, you have emergent laws that do not appear at the level below.
Right. So just to talk about this coarse graining. So, there was, we always used to say, right, physics is dirty math, chemistry is dirty physics, biology is dirty chemistry, and then, the social sciences
There's an XKCD comic strip, which is like the panel just has like the different fields of science, from anthropology to and then biology and so on and so forth, all the way to physics. And physics is like, it's great to be like here at the top. And then all the way to the right, you have the mathematicians say, hey guys, I didn't even see you out there, right? And of course, there's another one where they have the philosopher like being both on the left and on the right. Coming like Pac-Man from both sides, like, whoa, this is weird, right? So but that's exactly it. It is, you are zooming out, right? As you're going more and more abstract, which means that you're losing the ability to have laws emerge. The ones that, when you're looking to do medicine, right, you don't have to memorize every possible chemical pathway. Right? Just the most important ones, and just the ones that are like have emerged to win out, right? To be the most likely ones, because of all the possible underlying mechanisms, they all give you the same answer at this new level. Right. That's the idea, right? If I look at you right now, right, to turn you from Hunter into Brian, I would have to do some serious reconstruction, right?
There would be some photoshopping required.
That's right. We'd have to increase the length of your arms and and so on and so forth. Anyways.
And my
oh my God. So imagine now that I take all of your molecules and I just transpose them with their neighbor. You would look exactly the same.
Right.
And there is like a trillion ways to do that or more.
Well, and in fact,
but you would look the same.
And in fact, the molecules in my body are constantly rearranging.
Oh, exactly.
So there are many permutations of any individual. That
at the micro, level, there is like a trillion versions of you. But when I zoom out from the genotype to the phenotype, they all look the same.
That's right.
And those are the ones that we call like the pattern. These are the ones from which we derive the laws of biology, the laws of chemistry, the laws of physics. But when they fail, we say, oh, that's an exception. What does that mean? It means that you're not at the right level. You have to go in. You have to go to the level where you have to keep track of a few of the coin flips, because it's no longer enough to just count how many there were.
And this is very much, to go back to that period where physics goes through this quantum revolution and this revolution in terms of relativity, there were a whole series of things that were failing, right? So the big example is like the photoelectric effect is one of them, where you would shine a light onto, do you want to explain that to the listeners?
Yeah. And then you would see some excitation,
electrons being thrown off.
Appearing and everything, how this makes no sense. And it was exactly when you started taking this seriously. The same thing with the double slit experiment, right? There were these moments, precisely, that's really well put, right? That you're thinking, okay, this makes no sense with the theory we currently have, but we just observed it, right? And very often what would happen if you were not a really good scientist, you would observe it once, maybe you wouldn't be able to reproduce it again because it's kind of hard, right? And then you say, that was just noise in my data. But if you're good enough and you keep seeing it again and again, you're like, I'm going nuts. Something is off here. Something important is happening. And then the beauty of it is that you would have to change the model of the universe because the previous one could not explain this phenomenon. And something amazing happens at that point. Once you expand a little bit, that radius, right, of what is supposed to be possible, the ones that you had truncated and renormalized, as I said earlier, right, where you said, it's not that this is unlikely, this was impossible. That's what you thought until now. Now you're like, wait, that's actually possible.
And it keeps happening.
That's right. And the moment that you expand just enough your theory, all of a sudden, all this other crazy stuff starts happening as well that you didn't ask for. And that's what happened actually with quantum entanglement, right? It's like very super strong correlation, no matter how far apart you are in the universe, between particles and other objects that was throwing Einstein off. And he's like, you cannot have this spooky action at a distance. It's because that came with like assuming that what we call now quantum physics was the right model. The way to explain, the right framework of physics was that was explaining the double slit experiment, for which Einstein was like, okay, that's kind of weird and everything, but, I'll let it go. But he came up with his own version, which is like, wait, if that's possible, then this other thing is possible where you can have this non-local action, this entanglement. And he freaked out. He's like, that's not possible until, somebody named Bell did an actual freaking experiment, right? Or proposed one. And then we had, some amazing experimentalists recently really just nail these experiments and say this is impossible unless the universe works in this very non-local, very weird way that quantum physics has said. We can prove it now with experiments, not just theories, right?
And so now you have a problem because the data does not fit your tidy little model.
Yes.
And so therefore you have to redo your model.
But that's the amazing thing. That's what I call science.
That is science.
That's the beauty of science. That is like you're waiting. Like the best scientists are not the ones that are right. That's not possible, right? Because as I said, they can only be as right as like the observations they've made so far, right? They're the ones that are like interesting enough in their theory where somebody else is going to come along and try to shoot it down. By coming up with new observations, by expanding that theory and saying, yes, this was correct, but it was an approximation to a deeper truth. Yeah. Right? And this truth is an approximation to a deeper one, and so on and so forth. The same way that, like, yes, you may become really good and start getting, like, maybe 70 heads in a row, right? Maybe 80. And then the better you become, right, the closer you get to this, like, ability to just get anything with equal probability, right? Whatever you want, you just like make it happen.
And so I think that what you've just said is really the core is that, real science, when people are really sort of living the scientific principle, right? When they're being experimental, not litigious, as Atul Gawande puts it, what you're really looking for is you're looking to always test what you believe and break it. You want to break it. You want it to fall apart because it's in shattering what you already have that you open up the possibility for something better to emerge.
That's right. And there is I think we talked about this over lunch. There's ways to reason about the world, right? And we all do this where we have an important belief we are emotionally attached to, right? And what do? Right? There is a couple of different options. The first one is to say, like, I'm right and I don't even need to do any research because I know I'm right, on this. So, you just say to the rest of the world, just screw you, right? There are the others that feel more enlightened. They do something worse. They go and they try to find all of the literature that will confirm their bias. And they will go deep. They will go nerd out all the way, right? Until they're the world expert in this sliver of knowledge or data, where they're like, no. There's so much data you don't even know that supports my claim. And they're forgetting these mountains of evidence on the other side, right, where they don't want to look. It can happen in religion. It can happen with, like, any of the big debates that we're talking about, where you're like, I have a lot of religious friends that they will tell me, okay, I'm a Christian or I'm a Muslim because I read, like, the holy book, and it made sense, right? And I said, okay, what about, did you read the competition, right? Did you say, okay, wait a minute, what do they have to offer? What are they saying, right? Or at least and it's like, yeah, I read it and it was wrong here and here and here. I was like, but with respect to what standard? And even growing up in Greece, we would have to do like religion as a subject, the same way we did literature and math and all the other stuff every day, right? And I loved that it wasn't until I think my junior year or senior year in high school where for the first time they gave us a different book. Because before it was always about Greek Orthodox religion and how amazing it is, right? But that one last year, they're like, okay, you're finally adults. You need to know the truth. There are other religions out there. So it was called comparative religion. But of course, the best part about this was that there would be a few pages about the religion, whether it was Zen Buddhism or Islam or whatever it was. And then there would be equally many pages afterwards explaining why that was wrong. Which I found incredible. I'm like, wow, this is truly comparative religious studies, right there. Yeah. So from that point of view, I guess I would say that this is the difference between faith or somebody who goes by faith and learning, and sometimes learning the right stuff, right, but without questioning, and someone who learns by questioning, and they're looking to find the truth, not because they're better human beings, right, but because of that curiosity, this itch you cannot scratch until you find a way to do it, and then you're like, oh, this is so exciting, because the truth should be able to explain and hold its own, right?
Doesn't need you. It doesn't need to be shored up. It doesn't need to be defended or rationalized. Yep. The point is that it stands on its own merit.
Yeah, and if I'm right, there is not even a notion of universal truth. There's more these levels of, if you want to survive, and if you want to be practical about life, some things will be much more likely than others.
Right.
So you should take them almost as the truth, remembering always that this is an approximation. Right. And if you want to do some miraculous stuff, some really cool things in your life, you need to be able to move between these different levels.
And that, I think, is really the key is, sort of in my own journey, my own scientific pilgrim's progress, it's, been understanding that there's a series of tools, and, people get caught up in one or the other, and it's kind of like you have a hammer and you're like, this is the greatest tool. I'm going to use this for everything. Everything looks like a nail. Yeah. And the point is that the hammer is good for some things, the screwdriver is good for other things, and it is that wisdom to know the difference, where you know what each tool is for, and then you know when to use it and can be discerning.
And it is important also because we are human beings and we don't have infinite energy to learn everything and to work on everything. I think at that point it is important as a human being to be able to say, you know what, that's where I'm standing, right? That was my journey, at least for now. I'm taking a break right now, right? So I will not fight you for moving ahead. Right. In fact, I think of whenever I think of a student, I don't think of them as damn it, they're going to outdo me. They're going to do better than me. They're going to have even more time to figure this out. It is the best tribute to any teacher is for their student to go further, right? It means you did something right. Yep. And also you can continue working on your own and raising the whole bar. But it feels to me that very often we think of the more successful people of the human race, that they're supposed to be at the very top of the pyramid, right? They climbed up, they had grit and everything, and now they're at the top, and they're like, yes, it's amazing over here. It's very lonely, but amazing. And it hit me at some point when I started to do more outreach and to meet some incredible people who, had left academia to do more of that, to communicate some of that, to go to the trenches, right? To teach and to create that empathy. I realized that maybe these people at the very top, sure, they're strong, but the strongest people are probably at the very bottom, holding everything up and pushing it further and further up. And not only that, but they're the ones that are getting shot on the whole time, because this pyramid of humanity does not move as one. Right. It's more a big tank of water, and you're trying to balance it while you're you allow it to be itself and reach for the stars in whatever way. It's very difficult.
And I think the key thing is also, we now have we're far enough along in human progress that we understand how human progress happens. And, the idea that it is about these geniuses, that it is about these lone figures, it just is ridiculous. Anybody who believes that has been duped. They just don't know any better, and they haven't been exposed enough. And, the analogy I've been using is Toto in The Wizard of Oz. He pulls back the curtain and shows you that there is no wizard.
Yeah.
And so there are a lot of people who haven't had the opportunity to peek behind the curtain yet and to realize that there are no wizards.
But it's a nice fable because, again, as I was saying earlier, sometimes you just want to stop and take a break and say, you know what, that's not going to be me, right? I just want to believe it's a fairy tale indeed, but I want to believe that there are people like that.
Yeah.
Like maybe one every 100 years that is going to change the world, right?
Yeah.
And of course, it's kind of like, celebrity is the same thing. There is so many more people doing so much amazing work to put them to place them on that pedestal, right?
Yep.
Where it is like, the hairdressers or like makeup artists or acting coaches, whoever it is, like, for an actor or actress. And you don't get to see those individuals, like the true masters, the mentors, the ones that are going to be there for them when things go bad, right? But you see the poster child. You see the one because, again, as humans, we cannot maintain all these relations
7
in our
billion
head,
people,
right?
yeah.
Exactly. You just say, okay, you are the head of the spear, right? And this is the spear that I would use were I to go on this journey. I'm not, but I'm just saying, maybe for my friends or like for everyone else, just like we tell people, you should take the bus. Everyone should take the bus. Just
That's
not
right.
me, but everyone else to do it. But it's okay. Sometimes, as human beings, it's important to conserve our energy to put it to best use.
And I think the key thing, to talk about these genius myths is, the Dunbar number. You can't know everybody, and you do need these abstractions. And Martin Luther King, for example, was very aware that there was a movement, but that the movement needed a figurehead. It needed a central figure around which to concentrate its energies. But I think the key thing is it's very much like what you were talking about in terms of your models or your view of the world. You can regard them as the truth, you can believe in them, but always to remember in the back of your head that it is this model, it is this abstraction.
It is an approximation based on your best, guess so far. And that's all you have in the end, right? Is that integrity again that you could bullshit it and say like, no. It's because that's the truth, right? And we know people that do that, right?
Yep.
They're organized, institutions. But there's also the others that say, well, that's all I know right now. And it's not because they want to tell anyone else. It's because they want to be honest with themselves. Also, from like a bookkeeping point of view, I realize, right, that you don't want, if you keep rationalizing or BSing everyone else, you will forget your true foundation, who you really are and where you're really standing.
Yep.
So you won't even know where to go next for your own pleasure, right, of this adventure. Like, okay, so what did I just do? What do I actually know when nobody's looking? Where do I go next? Right. So it is important to have that, even if it is more selfish. I think it's okay.
And I think crucially, I think so much of it, I think, is how are you... when you understand that it is about the wisdom of crowds and that human intelligence is collective, that, I think that the key is to make your knowledge and your ignorance transparent. Because then what you're doing is you're inviting the group to take your knowledge and run with it and build on it, and also to then step in to help your ignorance. Part of what's been so interesting about, doing this whole mixed mental arts project is, I've been very transparent about my utter lack of web skills, social media skills, design skills.
That's because that's the only weakness you have.
No, I also have the weakness that I am not Brian Callen. Let's remain
okay.
Let's remain on message. Yeah. But the result is that what's great is that you make those weaknesses transparent and people rush in and they want to help and they want to complement your weaknesses because what's been cool about this community is it's a group of people who understands many of these things for whatever reason and they resonate with the message, and it's that's what's so great about the internet is you can put this stuff out there and the people who are on board with it come out and they find you.
There is something interesting about the internet that sometimes at the darkest places of the internet you will also find individuals who are the most genuine. Maybe they believe opposite things from you, right? But at the same time, they're the ones that will try to shut down any form of hypocrisy,
Mm-hmm.
right? If you're not genuine,
Yep.
they will respect you more for being true to yourself,
Mm-hmm.
owning it, right, than just pretending.
Yep.
You know, and then pretending that you don't have any flaws, that like, you know, everything is wonderful, everything is great, there is no issues in the world and all that stuff. So, but yeah, it is, once we have that, I think,
Mm-hmm.
once we have this more uniform trust,
Mm-hmm.
right, whether we like each other or not, that at least we're being honest as
Well-
much as possible, that it's okay to be yourself, right?
Yep.
Then the real conversation starts.
Well, and the key thing is that trust. And when you talk about, you know, what I would call the sort of the Pixar Spirit of 76 environment, that's what defines that environment. It is trust and mutual respect, where if we don't understand something that the other person is saying, we feel comfortable saying something about that, and we feel comfortable talking it out until we do understand it, because we know that from that conversation will emerge something better than what we both had before. And, you know, having done a bunch of teaching, I know that that's part of what you learn in teaching is that every time you have to explain something, you come to understand it yourself better, because what you're having to do is you're having to wrestle with the knowledge and break it down and figure out how to communicate it in different ways. And you acquire, it's very much like shaping. I think about this in terms of like shaping stone tools. The more you use it, the better honed it becomes.
I see that. Yeah, that makes total sense.
Yeah. So to bring it back to, you know, these two you know,
theories.
they're trying to unify them.
Yes.
And the problem is that they just don't, every time you try and put the balloons together, they both pop.
Exactly. And I think, personally, I think the problem is, and I think it's becoming more and more accepted, that you have two balloons, and the balloons have this surface, that's what we call space-time. Both quantum field theory and general relativity assume that object's existence and certain properties for it, right? And in fact, quantum field theory, when it's useful, you try to assume that that space-time object on top of which you put the fields satisfies Einstein's equations, right? And that's when you start getting also infinities, right? But what if you don't? What if you don't assume that space and time are fundamental, right? What if you think of other things from which these two concepts could derive or could emerge from, right? And the nice thing is that as a mathematician, I can immediately imagine what these other things could be. Because in mathematics, you have mathematical spaces which do not look like geometrical spaces. Meaning, like, you don't have a notion of distance, for example. You have a different notion, a notion of correlation. And once you realize that,
just to talk about the correlation thing, so that the point is that it's not that, you know, two sides are 5 centimeters apart, a notion of distance. It's that they have a certain relationship between each other.
Exactly. The same way that, like, say you fall in love with someone, and it doesn't matter how far away they are, you can't stop thinking about them. Okay, Brian? So... So my point is that correlation, what if it was more fundamental than distance in space?
Okay.
What if the stronger the correlation, the closer we thought of them as being in some mental space we create, or some even real, what we call reality, right? Because every time, right, you see what's happening here, every time you do something, in order to figure out how far away something else is, you send a messenger, whether it is light or sound vibrations, right, or anything. If we turn off the lights, right, it's complete darkness, I have no idea until you say something, right, how far away you are. You may be on the other side of the universe. I know you have a smirk on your face, like, we're not going to turn off the lights, okay? It's not happening.
I'm so excited, Spiros.
I'm scared right now to even, like, consider this thought experiment.
It's but you just got to relax into it, Spiros. It's a little bit scary, but just relax into it. I'll do my best to look like Brian Callen.
You have a dark soul. Dark soul hunter. So let's go back to the, this idea, right? That maybe correlation is more fundamental, right? And in fact, in quantum physics, before you go to quantum field theory, before you promote the rules of quantum physics to put them in space-time, to put them in some like particular geometry, right? At that place, all you have is correlations. What we call, again, we've talked about this before, what we call quantum entanglement. What you have is that there are some subsystems of the whole, right, which get to relate really well with some other ones. There is no notion of how far they are. There is no you don't have any neighbors or anything yet.
The issue is how strong is the relationship?
Exactly.
How madly in love with each other
That's
are
right.
they?
And you can think of it concretely like this. You change this particular system, it has a state. Maybe it's on or off, right? Possible states. And you change it from off to on. And then you look, if that is like a light bulb, right? A quantum light bulb, you look at all the other ones that lit up. There's going to be a bunch of them that will. And you don't even know how far they were. You could be like looking at a sea of this mathematical abstract space and you find them.
Right.
And as you find them, what you do is you mentally want to put them closer together. Why? Because every time this one lights up, you don't want to go looking, right? It's like defragmenting your hard drive. You want to put the things closer, right, to each other because of relations that they have in the database or your hard drive, closer together because you can reach them much faster. And then what you end up doing is you end up creating an emergent space of things where the things that are closer together were really the ones that were most likely to be correlated, to be affected by the same change. Something you did here, immediately something else like said, yep, something is happening to me as well, right? So it is more of a map of correlations that gets promoted and interpreted by our minds and like the way we do even science. The way you observe anything is through correlations, right?
Right.
You don't observe directly anything, right? You send a messenger out, it gets entangled, correlated with the state of the object you want to understand, right? And then it comes back to you. And that also explains the uncertainty principle of Heisenberg, right? Like, we forget that there's always a messenger, and the messenger has its own agenda.
So
right?
So to break this down, right? The way that I've been explaining this is that there's reality, and it's this thing that's out there, right? And then there are our minds that is creating these various projections that are trying to make sense of reality. And, on the simplest level, our eyes take in these photons of light and then process it and turn it into an image. And, we create, and sometimes, the image, we see things that aren't there. We see illusions, right? Yeah. We see a mirage. We see a face on Mars when it's really probably just, it is just that our faces are obsessed with faces. Yes. So we always see faces where there are none. But on top of that, what science is about doing is creating these models of reality based on the data that we collect. So we create these models of disease, we create all of these models, and the point is that those models are then tested. But it is this, we are sending things out. So, I have a model that if somebody is sick with, a bacterial infection, that if I send in this group of drugs that we call antibiotics, that it will make that bacterial infection go away. And then I get a response from reality, and then my model has to change in response to that, or it should change if I'm...
So here's a mental model to think of how science works even at the level of quantum physics, right? I think that will be helpful. It's kind of like every time we ask a question, we shape reality. Why? The same way, remember what I said before, right, with the coin flipping. If you flip a coin 100 times, if you ask the question of like, how many heads and tails did you have and where were they, right? It's gonna get you very different answers, right? From the question, how many heads were there? I don't care where they were. That's it. The question alone is such a big hammer because it is literally like you're sending out this little like sprite into the world, a little fairy that you think of as a small thing, innocuous. She's just going to go there, knock on the door, right? Whatever you want to know. It's going to ask the question, then come back to you. That's not how it works, right? Usually you send like, Hulk, right, to ask the question. And the system that is supposed to answer is so petrified that it's just like, yes. There's so much more richness, right, to all the possibilities that it has. And it's like, I'm just going to, whatever you want to hear, I'm just going to say to you. What is like most likely for me, I'll just say that. So it collapses, as we say, this wave function, right? But that's simply because the question itself, the nature of the question, you can interpret it, almost anthropomorphize it, like, into some entity that goes out there and becomes the messenger for you. And it could be really like, very subtle and easy to connect and relate and get the true nature of the object that you're trying to understand, like light, right, of very low energy. Or it could be very, very big, like, for example, shooting something in a wall, the wall is Hulk.
Right.
Right, and you're like, oh, do you go up or down? No, I wanted to go left, right, through the wall, whatever. But I'm kind of petrified right now. So I just said, I'm going up, right, half the time or something. And that's what creates the sense of objective reality. There's all these other possibilities, but because we keep asking the wrong questions from the point of view of like digging deeper, right, we end up getting the same answers. We create theories based on the tools, the questions that we get to ask.
Right, and so the with these two balloons, what being a mathematician allows you to do is to cut down and ask much more fundamental assumptions. And
well, yeah, I mean, anyone can do this, right? You know, if they want. Well, not anyone, I guess, but like anyone who is told, okay, yes, maybe the foundation of all like reality and quantum gravity, the theory of everything, is quantum entanglement, right? From which these correlations, we interpret these as being distances. The stronger the correlation, the closer we think of these quantum blobs, right? And then from there, you create that manifold, as we call it, space-time, on top of which you put the fields and so on and so forth. So at that place, you have unification. You can think of it that way, because if that entanglement can both give you the way you measure distances in space-time, right, which is equivalent to gravity, because once you have that metric, as we call it, the way to measure distances, you can also understand the curvature of space-time. And if all of that is coming from correlations, but correlations are the bread and butter of quantum field theory, because it's quantum, right? You're done, right? You can even understand the nature of quantum fields themselves. But it's not so simple, again, because as you're getting like from this basement level, right, to the next levels at which you start seeing differentiation, both in the tools being used to understand these theories, right, and also in the power that they have to explain things. That tether that keeps these like together, right? They were friends, best friends, when they were like, at that level of like quantum entanglement or even below math and stuff. They start like, veering apart from each other. It's as if like, their relationship gets strained. They met new friends. They have new rules they have to satisfy and so on and so forth. And then they don't get together at the highest level now, where we understand it as quantum field theory and general relativity. They no longer even speak to each other. So whenever they come together, they look like there is infinities, right? And they're yelling at each other, and it makes no sense. Even though when you forget about the other side and you only focus on either of them, everything is perfect. Perfectly, like, scientific and rigorous and all that stuff, right? It just doesn't work when you try to put them together, because you shouldn't do it at that level. You should go below, right? You should unify them at the place from which they both emerged, and they emerge as different projections of the same type of deeper reality, right?
So here's, because I think what's fascinating about this, and again, we have different frames of reference. Like at lunch, part of what was interesting is I would explain something that I'd been reading, and then Spiros would say, "Oh, of course, it's just like this thing in quantum physics," because that's what Spiros thinks about all day.
Doesn't everyone do that?
no, Spiros. I can tell you that not everybody does that, but it was amazing and beautiful to see. But the one of the really interesting experiences that I had, and I was talking about when I first voted, and I think what was intriguing there is that I started reading Locke and Rousseau and even Marx, and what
you're probably the only person on earth to read these for their first voting day.
Well,
you are a little insane, which is why I like you, man.
Well, but it was actually...
You're like, I'm going to nerd out on this, right? I'm going to do this right.
Well, but that was the interesting thing, is that was about the only thing I did right in college. Like, I was much more interested in figuring that out than I was in doing my homework. But the interesting thing is that you come to realize that and this was, I think partly coming from a science background, you come to realize that all of these different theories of government and society rest on assumptions about human nature. Yeah. And they had different assumptions of human nature. And part of what struck me is we hadn't really re-examined those assumptions about human nature, even though we had, 200 plus more years of anthropology and biology and biochemistry and neuroscience. And
it's like we assumed that human nature was static and irrespective of the environment and the circumstances, right, of the evolution of the rest of the
but also the data that they had available to them. I mean, so much of it is they specifically were interested in what was the state of nature. So what was man like before large scale societies existed, and these guys lived in Europe. and America, and they didn't even have access to, hunter-gatherer tribes. They didn't really know, they hadn't done any of that comparative, to be able to even see that. And, people like Descartes were guessing at how the brain worked. They didn't, and he was like, mind and body are separate, but somehow they have to also be connected. So I'm going to make up that it's the pineal gland.
Great guess.
Great guess.
But no. It's actually my favorite example of that is Aristotle, one of the greatest minds.
Yep.
Of, ancient Greek times and further. He never actually bothered to go to a woman and ask her to open her mouth and count how many teeth she had. So he just guessed the number, saying that women have 5 fewer teeth than men. And people took it seriously, and you're like, that's not a hard experiment to make, right? But he was probably such an ass that he's like, I better not even ask. It's like, it's not going to end well. Like, you're going to, bite my finger or something. So.
How long does that persist as cultural prejudice before anybody re-examines it? And the other great.
Do we actually know what the answer is?
I don't. I'm a little scared. Vagina dentata. But the other one that I along the lines of Aristotle is, Aristotle thought that the brain was the body's air conditioning system. Like, he thought it was a cooling system, and if you look at it, you can see, it kind of looks like pipes, whatever. But so I think it was just interesting that these assumptions that were made about human nature. And it was just fascinating to me the degree to which nobody ever bothered to go and re-examine those assumptions and say, what do we know about human nature? And with all this extra knowledge about human nature, shouldn't we then re-examine how well these models hold up? And you find that some of them, they hold up pretty well. If you look at what's going on in the evolution research, capitalism is a special case of evolution. We understand now that it fits within that larger model. There's a great book called The Gardens of Democracy that really sort of views a democracy or any society in terms of being an evolutionary system, where you understand that parasitism, weeds will emerge as a strategy, and they have to be plucked out and managed. It has to be tended, and that there is a certain experimental nature with it, where you're trying things out, you're seeing how the soil responds, and then you're trying to produce better and better outcomes.
Doesn't that make sense, though, that everything is pretty much evolutionary? Because there is no intelligence until there is. Mm-hmm. You see what I mean? That you're just trying random stuff, especially when something is hard or complicated. Before you have a chance to become good at intelligent design. You want to think of it that way, right? Almost after the fact. So it's kind of you're just trying a bunch of stuff, right? Mm-hmm. And whatever wins, whatever seems to be more practical and survives, actually becomes kind of the truth. But that's the whole thing about the laws of physics themselves. It's not that,
exactly.
Why is it the cosmological constant, whatever it is? And, why is the permeability of, free space what it is? These forces, where do they come from, and so on and so forth? And you have to think of it from the point of view that, these laws of physics crystallized from something that was more like liquid, where everything was just out there, and there was no order, right? There didn't need to be any order. And so once you zoom out, you have this breaking of the symmetry that we call, in physics, the spontaneous breaking. Something if it doesn't break, then there is nothing there, because if everything is happening, then nothing is happening, right? Think of it that way. It's as if for the first time you have something pull ahead, right? And because of this evolutionary pressure, whatever, the one thing that survives enough, the same way that rich people get richer.
Yep.
Right? You have new opportunities the moment that you're away from the rest of the people, right? The rest of the configurations that are possible. And all of a sudden you feel super special. Because I made it out. No, it was a fluctuation, and then that gave you, right, a competitive advantage that then gave you more and more and more. As people you zooming out more and more, you're like, wow, there's only one. And that's the truth.
Yep.
Right? The rest don't even exist. Because you don't even get to see them.
And
right?
there are, I think firstly, it makes absolute sense that it's evolution all the way up and down. And
it's a very if you think about it, like honestly, like I'm not even being facetious here, is the most intelligent design possible.
Yep.
The one where you don't need to have anyone think of like the design a priori.
Well, it would
just
be,
you let it run, and then it just like creates its own like structure.
Well, the interesting thing is that when Newton, and I think this is in the Patricia Farah book, I'm going to get all my Newton biographies wrong.
I don't even know what you're talking about, so I believe you.
Well, no, but I mean, someone will go and check this out. But yeah, it is Patricia Farah. That one I'm fairly certain of. But one of the things that she talks about is that when Newton first laid out the Principia Mathematica, some religious people reacted against it because it violated what was in the Old Testament, this idea that God was physically moving everything, and the idea that the planets were moving on their own was upsetting. But they ultimately moved past that. Yeah. And if you think about it, again, it's not a very intelligent designer that would have to physically move all the planets. It's
not like a kid who's playing with like little soldiers here and there and just making everything happen according to their design, whatever it is.
The much more impressive magic trick is to set the thing up in such a way that the system that you want emerges.
And the best thing, even more impressive than that, is like to not even do that.
Yeah.
And still for it to happen anyways, right?
Mm-hmm.
And there's something amazing, like I had this revelation recently within the past year, because I was trying to figure out how the hell is it possible for any order to come from complete disorder.
Mm-hmm.
I don't just mean like, kind of disorder. I mean like flatness,
mm-hmm.
meaning everything is the same.
Mm-hmm.
How the hell, right? Can you get anything from that?
Mm-hmm.
It's like you're getting something from nothing, right? Mm-hmm. Where there is no truth because everything is equally true or equally false if you think of it that way. But then somehow something keeps happening again and again and again. How do you do that, right? What is there a mechanism for
mm-hmm.
emergent truth?
Mm-hmm.
That's what I started thinking about. Like, and at what level does it work?
Yep.
And I realized it's actually at the level of mathematics. It's not even
mm-hmm.
at the level of physics.
Mm-hmm.
There is something, again, that concept of concentration of measure.
Mm-hmm.
If you think of measure is another word in mathematics, more fancier word for probability,
mm-hmm.
right? For like saying, okay, how likely is something among all the possibilities? And it's like a histogram, right? So if you think of a histogram, which is like these little rectangles telling you the height of them tells you how often you get to see that, the frequency, right? This particular outcome. When you have like a histogram that is like flat,
mm-hmm.
it means they're all equally likely. Mm-hmm. Nothing is more likely than anything else, right? You kind of like the coin flip, any particular configuration of 100 coin flips is equally likely.
Right.
But something weird happens again when you ask the wrong question
mm-hmm.
because you don't have enough resolution to ask the very specific question. You almost like you squint your eyes, right? And you all of a sudden start seeing stuff appear. And that was like, the revelation that there are mechanisms of emergence, like ways simply because we don't ask the right questions or we ask our own version of questions or because we get to interact with the ground truth in ways that are like not at the highest resolution possible,
mm-hmm.
that we end up seeing these illusions of some things becoming much more likely than others
mm-hmm.
simply because there is a mapping of like many to one. Right? There's many ways for you to look the same way as you do now, right? Or for the same reason that the air in this room where we are right now talking is not all gathered up on this corner up there.
Yeah.
Right? It's not because that's impossible. It's because
it's incredibly unlikely.
Exactly. That's the second law of thermodynamics.
So just to break that down, there's, countless possibilities where we would experience the air as being evenly distributed in the room. In inverted commas.
There's like a billion, and it's very simple to think. Why?
Yeah.
Because you can take any two molecules,
right,
air molecules, and transpose them, change their relative positions with each other. You would feel the same way. You wouldn't even be able to tell the difference, right? And how many ways are there to do that? There is a lot of ways.
And how many ways are there for all of the molecules to just happen to go in one little corner of the room?
This is a much smaller volume for them.
That's right.
You can kind of tell the difference, right? The same way when you have, you put some milk in your coffee and you start stirring,
mm-hmm.
right? You can arrange the molecules any way you want, but you will be stuck with that. You will not be able to unstir it to the way where like the milk was just at the top.
So
a
have
very
you-
small number of ways for you to do that. That's why.
So have you read Cesar Hidalgo's Why Information Grows?
I have not. No.
Oh. See, it's
I
very...
usually watch anime instead of reading.
Oh, really?
That's where I actually learn like about the world.
What anime do you watch?
Well, I'm very sad because Naruto just ended like yesterday. I haven't eaten since like lunch. Anyways, but that was a big one.
Well,
But I watch a lot of them, not just
not just
Blue,
Naruto.
all the good stuff.
were you big into anime as a kid, or is that something
No,
that's come
this
later
just
in
happened-
life?
That happened in college.
Yeah.
I had a friend who's like, you know what, we need to watch some hentai, and I'm like, I don't know what you're talking about. Let's do it. And then that turned into a love for anime.
Well, that's good.
Yes, and Japanese culture in general.
In general,
Yeah,
it's a good culture to love.
Yes.
No, but I mean, I think Japanese culture is like such a great part of the appeal is that it is such a culture that is so different from Western culture.
Yeah.
And so it is part of that sort of hero's journey of seeking out what you lack. But yeah.
That's a nice way to put it. Thank you. I just like the sushi.
Well, and the anime.
No, it is amazing.
Yeah,
Yeah,
it is
I'm
amazing.
going back there again this summer. So.
Oh, you are? Where are you going?
Oh yes, I'm going both to Tokyo, Kyoto, Hiroshima. So
Oh.
I want to explore a little more.
Yeah, understandably. Are you going to have some good okonomiyaki?
Of course.
Yeah.
Tempura, okonomiyaki,
Yeah.
Tsukiji market sushi, all the good
There's
stuff.
there's an okonomiyaki place now on Sawtell that's very good that does Hiroshima style okonomiyaki.
Wow.
So
okay.
I'm gonna have to take you there as a small thank you for dropping
I
knowledge.
will
on
not
us.
say no to that. No.
It's very good.
All right. Cool. So
but-
where were we? Yes.
Well, so what I was going to say is, there's this Cesar Hidalgo who's at MIT has written this book, Why Information Grows. It came out a few years ago. But what was fascinating for me in reading it is that it meshes in these very interesting ways with everything that's happening in evolutionary theory, where it is saying that there is a selection pressure in terms of there's a selection pressure towards order and towards complexity. And
I would say like that this is so obvious it's not even worth like mentioning why, but I will anyways, right?
Do it.
And here it is, right? Like in 30 seconds. So imagine that every time you have this mapping from many to one, right? What is happening? Even though the ground truth, right, has a lot of other possibilities that could give rise to an emergent truth different from what you're used to, okay? When you keep flipping those coins, right, where you keep throwing these darts, at the level of the ground truth, you will keep being part of this larger pool, a much larger one, right? So there's not just an element of like, this happens once in a while. If you try to fluctuate away from it, if you get lucky enough to escape the black hole kind of thing, right, of all these billions and billions of possibilities relative to the other like 20 that are out there, okay? What is going to happen the next moment when you flip that coin again? You're going to be dragged back into that black hole, which means that the emergent truth you will see will keep going back, most likely, to the more likely event because of these very many becoming a single truth at this higher level, right? That's it. There is not just like the moment of like happening because it's more likely. It will continue being more likely.
And so it's a building towards more and more and more likely events.
Yes, and it is like almost the rules become rules almost of these large masses of things happening at this more ground truth level and how they're like, moving. You can move because you may have also what is called periodic structures, right?
Right.
Where you don't just have like one ground truth emerging to like, something very likely, but maybe two or three of them, and you get to oscillate. That's why a lot of things in the universe love to oscillate or have these periodic, like, structures, right? Whether you're going around the sun ever and ever again, whether you have a harmonic oscillator, like, as we call like in quantum physics, going back and forth, up and down. It's because you can't decide. There is no reason for you, right, to be one or the other at that level. So you just keep flipping the coin and it keeps going up and down, up and down, up and down. And from these collective oscillations, you end up getting higher truths, right? These emergent truths that end up looking like the laws of physics.
Right.
Right. And that's, I think that's interesting.
So I think it's incredibly interesting because also a lot of, when people think about science, they have this idea that the vision that science provides of the universe is that it's all chaotic and that, there's no emergent order or direction or purpose, these very sort of human desires for purpose and direction. And I think what a lot of this new science is adding up to is that the universe has a direction, and that
and it is interesting. Like, I was having a dinner recently with Stephen Fry and some other friends, and we're going back and forth about some of these things. And he's a poet. I mean, like, he's kind of like you, actually, in many ways. He has read so much, and he has such breadth that I'm like, wow, this guy, every time I tell him something, he puts it in from a classical ancient Greece point of view to Rome and so on and so forth, right? All the way to these times.
I think Stephen Fry and I went to the same school, and I have to just check.
I have a feeling you're right. Yes, it's just like, just drop it, right? Right there, name dropping. But anyways, the point is that I was telling him, right, about this notion of truth, that maybe it's more probabilistic, right? That maybe it's not like cut and dry, but at the same time, it's not really relative, right? It is, but it's not. It's not in the same way that we say, okay, everything is equally true. If you believe that, then why don't you just jump off a cliff?
Right.
And it's equally likely that you will fly up instead of fall down, right? So you can say that everything is potentially true. That's very different from like everything is equally true at every level of reality. And that's the job of a good scientist, is to understand the difference between these two, right? Someone who is going by faith will do something else. Will say, no, this is truth at all levels, right? And everything else is not true. A good scientist will say, you're right. This stuff here is really true, right? Most likely. And if you want to live a good life by surviving or whatever, like, this is the wisdom through traditions and all that stuff. Yes. But there is a ground truth below, which if things change there, then this becomes obsolete. This is no longer the many-to-one mapping you were looking for, right? There is a different one now, and you have to evolve. You have to understand that because things changed below, there is a new kid on the block, right? New rules apply, and you have to be flexible to think like that. But at the same time, it doesn't mean that truth is relative, and it doesn't mean that it is absolute either. So I hope this clarifies this tension that exists between people saying, no, it's either absolute or it is relative to your perspective. Neither of them is correct, right? There is like a more subtle, point here to be made, that at the deeper level, fluctuations at that level end up giving you new predictive power. And as these dynamics change, you end up getting new emergent truths.
And I think that it's that predictive power, it's the ability to make sense of things and to find meaning. And a lot of what I've been thinking about as well is that there is this idea that science begins 300-400 years ago, or that it emerges at some point. But I think what's interesting is that, based on what we now know about the human brain, man has always searched for meaning. We've always been trying to make better and better models for making sense of things. But the interesting thing is so much of it is limited by our ability to observe. What are our tools? And, part of what changes, 400 years ago, 500 years ago, is we get the telescope, we get the microscope, and suddenly we can observe things at a resolution and observe levels of reality that weren't available. And what's incredibly interesting, John Haidt has this great book, The Happiness Hypothesis, which I reference at least once a podcast. But what's interesting, and it was, this really profound experience for me, because I had thought that, these old cultural prejudices that I think exist often within science, that everything before science was a waste of time, and then we showed up and started it, and what the happiness hypothesis you come to realize is that science has just reclarified much of what the ancients already knew in the realm of human behavior. That people like the Buddha and Jesus and Muhammad and Aristotle, Aristotle may not have known how many teeth a woman had, but there were certain things that they had figured out, and that they were able to form good models because they were able to simply observe with their eyes, with
And it is definitely a balance of rigidity and flexibility, right? You have to be rigid so you can hold on to your beliefs long enough to clarify them and to see how true they are, right? Instead of just flip-flopping all the time and saying, the sun is not going to come up tomorrow. Oh, no, the sun is going to... So this can be annoying as well to other people because, clearly, right, that's more likely to happen than this one. But at the same time, you need to have enough flexibility that you are ready to ride the wave, right, when the wave of change comes. And not only can you ride the wave, but also you can tell others how to ride the wave so they don't all, go the way of the dodo bird, right? So it's very important that we have... Again, I keep coming back to this notion of intellectual integrity, but it's not really just intellectual, it's like emotional integrity.
Well, I think the two are inherently linked, because I think you have to be emotionally aware enough to know, A, what emotions are really driving your thinking, and to be able to check in and see what the appropriate level of certainty is based on what you know, and based on what new evidence is coming along, and are you accepting that evidence or rejecting that evidence because you are really engaged in an endeavor to try and make the best model of reality, or because it's your pet theory, it's your pet idea, and you really want to defend it at all costs.
Yeah, and for me, it just makes sense now. My dad always said he never really finished high school. I think he got a GED at some point. But he would tell me and my brothers that, the essence of intelligence is adaptability. And I didn't understand what he meant. And I'm like, no. The essence of intelligence is how well you do in math.
Yeah.
Right? I thought as a kid, right? Because everybody else said you're so smart, you're doing so well, you're going to math Olympiads. I'm like, this has to be, right? Because people are scared of it. So the more intelligent you are, the more easy it should be for you. And I was thinking at some point in grad school, one of my fellow math graduate students, Korean, he told me okay, so we think we're hot stuff because we're smart enough to understand all these theoretical models of algebra and geometry and this insane stuff to maintain it in our heads and manipulate them. But who gives a damn, right? What if, right, we're useless when the flood comes, or when we need to go from point A to point B and we don't even know how to drive or something like this, right? And these other people survive and we're just gone.
That's right.
And it's actually very true. In many ways, we're very useless, right? Until somebody else can take these ideas and make them more and more useful.
That's right.
So you need the whole structure. But at that point, I was like, oh, wow. It makes sense why my dad kept saying, I don't care whether you will become an Einstein. I want you to become Rambo. I'm like, he's watching too many movies. We're growing up in Greece, but that's okay. Yeah. But it makes sense now. It is about survival and adapting to all these changes. It's not just about physical adaptation. It's about these mixed mental arts, right? That you can feel comfortable straddling 2 or 3 or 4 different worlds at the same time.
Yep.
Right? Bridging them and being able to appreciate the beauty and value in every single one of them. Because very often it is you become so enamored with your point of view that everything else becomes dark. The same way that for an academic like me, very often, right, I hear colleagues saying, the dark side, the financial tech industry, and so on and so forth. And it's easy to vilify and dehumanize and all that stuff. The other side, and they make fun of us because we're useless and we don't actually like make any money and all that stuff. But it's not really either side, right? Being true. There is elements of it, but it's a caricature.
It's the stories that tribes tell about each other. And the problem is that, we're all better off together, because it is by trying to resolve out our differences and learn from each other that we evolve things that are better than what either of us would have had on our own.
Very, very, very true. And I love doing that. This is why I love doing research. This is why I love doing outreach, because especially through outreach, most academics don't even understand the power of outreach, right? I didn't even understand myself until I started doing more and more of it. And it's because you get asked these weird ass questions. You're like, kid, what the hell are you smoking? Right? Don't you know how gravity or magnetism works?
Yeah.
No, I don't even know how it works until somebody asked me the right question. You're like, oh crap, right? I thought I knew, right? Or I thought I knew what was supposed to be fundamental. Space and time. Come on. How can you even think outside of it, right? Immanuel Kant is like, that's the one thing you take for granted. It's the canvas upon which reality gets created. Until I was like, wait, there is another mental concept that could underlie potentially both of them, right? I didn't even go into the emergence of time. That'll be another time, right? But this is the moment you have that, you're like, holy crap. Now everything is possible, right? It felt before you couldn't even make a step forward. There's no other way. You just have to keep ramming them into each other as these big like blob theories and then hoping to resolve these infinities through just better mathematics and all that stuff. But all you need to do was to find a new magnifying lens. Because infinity was nothing but an assumption that if you were to go any further at some resolution, right, of what's happening at the microscopic scale, it would look the same as before, right? That you would have an infinite amount of things happening there. No, it's simply because you couldn't understand this lower level substructure and to see that there is no infinity there. There's just like 5 things happening. That's it. It's very benign, right? But you never were able to get there, and you just assumed it should look the same as everything else at the different scales, and that's how you get infinities, right? It's silly, but, it's hard. The math is hard, so that's the best we can do often, right? But it's very powerful when somebody from the outside or somebody's like who is cuckoo but not cuckoo enough and knows, has enough tools and is serious enough to think about other stuff, say, what about this? And it's not like me who's coming up with all this stuff, right? Like some like great physicists from around the world that they used to be the ones thinking, well, there is nothing but this, but they had enough flexibility to say, what if space is emergent from entanglement, right? And like there is a dictionary between really high energy physics and low energy physics. And that was like an amazing moment, like from at which point even string theory, we used to make fun of it, like we'll never be able to see anything because at these high energies, like we will never reach those, so we'll never test it. It's not testable until you realize that maybe there is a physical dictionary of really high energy phenomena which have their equivalent structure, what is called a duality, right, into very low energy. There's a kind of phenomenon that you see in quantum matter that we're actually studying here at Caltech. So we're literally thinking of doing tabletop experiments to understand the inside of black holes with like some piece of like, metal or whatever, right, that has just the right properties. Because you can prove that like the two of them will have the same structure of correlations, hence the same type of like, answer to the question as if you were within
a black hole,
which is insane, right? So,
well, I think that if you ever had any doubt what a real scientist looks like, it is Spiros Michalakis, because what you see is that it is a very experimental mind that Spiros has. He's playing with possibilities. He's testing things out. He's trying to figure out why he's wrong. There's a humility, a curiosity, and I think that's always the biggest thing that I get from Spiros's conversations with Spiros. I don't necessarily track everything, but I do. The emotional climate that Spiros creates is always one of exploration and one of experimentation and of joy and wanting to share. And it's that spirit that I think is really the spirit of science. And that is the spirit of, the best of, I think, every culture, whether it's Christianity or Buddhism or Islam or America or, Greece. It is the best of humanity. It is that spirit of 76. And that's what we aim for here. And, the last time that the great Brian Callen was on Mixed Mental Arts, we ended with talking about, this idea of the jobocalypse and the fact that we now are in an environment where, to the point of Spiros' dad, we constantly have to adapt. It's not that adaptation is something that you occasionally have to do. It's something that you always have to do. You're always running up against other cultures. You're always finding that your old skills are not necessarily valuable, that you're having to readapt. And we sort of buttoned that with the idea that you always have to put the white belt back on. And, there is no more profound lesson in the limits of your knowledge than realizing that space-time may not be the most fundamental thing. So I thank you, Spiros, for always reminding us to put the white belt back on.
Thank you, Hunter. This has been amazing. Thanks for this opportunity. And I do agree that very often the scariest thing to do is to put that white belt back on, whether it is because of pride or because it's almost like you have to go back in high school and you're like, no, I don't want to do that. That was terrible. I survived it, right? But true strength, I think, comes from that,
Yep.
from being able to go back. And the good news is that very often going back after you've had training, it makes a big difference. It makes the experience so much more fun,
Yep.
so much more interesting. I've had people who've hated calculus all their lives, and for some reason they decide to jump back in, and then it starts clicking. This is amazing. For me, this happened more recently. I was playing the piano when I was a kid, and we weren't doing very well financially, so we had to sell the piano at the time. So I missed the piano through many, many years. So I was able to get a keyboard more recently and start practicing myself. And all this fear I had of maybe I was just not cut out. I could even be able to read music, and I'm a mathematician, and how they say, but I didn't take any music theory. But it started coming back to me so much faster than I expected. And it wasn't even that was fun. It was the self-esteem goes through the roof, because we all have these parts of our lives where we're no, that's not me.
Right.
Right? And it is exactly when you break those ceilings that you feel amazing, that you connect with humanity at a different level. So yes, thank you for having me here.
Well, and I think, part of what we want to do, there's a real sadness that this is no longer called the Brian Callen Show, because if we were to emulate humanity around a single idea, it should probably be Brian Callen. But now that it is Studley man. But now that it is mixed mental arts, what that offers us is more flexibility with the dojo, and it doesn't have to all be centered around Brian Callen, and we can podcast more regularly, and we can start to bring in other senseis who are going to teach us other things, and that we can all teach each other and evolve far better culture than any of us have had before.
That's a really great idea.
Well, so I'd like to introduce humanity to another sensei in the Mixed Mental Arts Dojo, Dr. Spiros Michalakis, or Dr. Strange, I think we're supposed to call him.
Oh my goodness. Thank you so much.
All right. Thanks so much, guys. Talk to you soon.
You've been listening to Mixed Mental Arts with Brian Callen and Hunter Motz. For more information and past episodes, please visit briancallen.com and mixedmentalarts.club. Also, be sure to follow the show on Twitter at Mixed Mental Arts. Until next time, bye-bye.